Hey everyone, welcome to the Diet Doc Life Mastery Podcast. I'm Joe Klemczewski with health psychologist Dr. Kori Propst, and we're going to dive right into a couple of topics this week that I think everybody's going to really find practical, Kori, because this is that time of the year. Not only are we past New Year's resolution, but for a lot of our people who are athletes getting ready for competitions or physique athletes getting ready for their sport, everybody's kind of in the grind, you know, their nose is in it and they're working hard. And so I've got a lot of conversations going every single day about, you know, am I doing this right? And I even had a client yesterday say, after a great conversation, I actually binged that night, Joe. It took me totally off guard, off track, and now we're having that talk. And so I know this is something that you have a lot of experience in, and I think we should cover it.
Yeah, it's so hard. You've experienced it before. I've experienced a binge before, and I work with a lot of clients who are recovering from varied levels of binge type eating. And I am often asked the question, Joe, like, will I ever be able to get rid of these binge thoughts? Will they ever disappear? And I've heard a lot of different things from various professionals about this too. And I've actually I've changed the way that I conceptualize this myself. I used to think, I don't know that that's the appropriate question actually, because it sets up this expectation that we could really become disappointed around and start feeling like we're failures if the binge thoughts do continue. But I have heard others say that I don't have them anymore. I used to have them. They don't exist anymore. They don't pop up. And then there's the in-between where, and this is kind of where I fall. I've never had an eating disorder that involved binge eating, but I was anorexic in college. And I do have thoughts that pop up related to restriction. Like, I'm not going to eat this anymore, or I'm not going, it's thoughts like that. So that they're never, and I say that with the utmost confidence, they are never going to send me into an anorexic spiral, but they're there. And this is where we get into how do we relate to them differently then, and how do we begin to relate to ourselves so that when they do pop up and when they are present, they don't grab a hold of us and take hold of us, and we don't fuse with them and identify with them.
And would you agree that binge eating has less of those components than anorexia or bulimia? I find that binging is more contextual. And so some people can escape those thoughts and those feelings and those urges because they're simply not dieting so aggressively all the time. It is not part of their identity, whereas some of the other disordered eating patterns really are.
I completely agree with you, because there is a very strong biological component when it comes to binge eating, and oftentimes it's due to people will binge to get rid of the binge thought. Like, it just keeps coming up and I want to get away from it. If I binge, it'll disappear, right?
Get it over with, right? I'm just going to eat
it. Get it over with. But why is the binge thought appearing in the first place? Well, typically it's because there's some sort of restriction happening. And typically it's restriction revolving food. And when our bodies get to a certain point, the brain is going to prompt us to eat, to take care of us. It's a protective mechanism. Now, the interesting thing is, if you look into your own life, I imagine you may find some binge restrict sort of behaviors that don't relate to food at all. We engage in binge restrict in various contexts of our lives. You brought up that word. I've done it with money before. I know people who do it with relationships, like, I'm swearing off all men. Like, that's a really silly, funny example, but you hear it all the time. Like, something has gone really poorly and we're really upset, and so we're going to completely knock this out of our lives. So now we're in this restrict mode. Well, how does that typically work out for us? Not very well. It's the restriction and the deprivation that often causes the binge itself. So we need to look less at the binge and look more at what's underneath it. What is prompting the binge in the first place? Is that?
Yeah, and I go back to the marriage of the physiology with the psychology, and I have been a victim of both individually. I've been a victim of the perfect storm, and when I say victim, I mean by choice, because it was always going too far, restricting too much, and it came that the psychological component was just the sheer pressure. As a new professional bodybuilder trying to become in the kind of condition that my genetics just really don't allow, I was willing to break my body, and end up on thyroid medication and things like that, because I just didn't care. I will accomplish this goal.
Right.
The psychological pressure just meant that much. And that meant often dieting on too low of food with too much restriction, pursuing too much cardiovascular work. And those are the places in my life where I would binge and I would get in those patterns of struggle.
So, we need to eat adequately. We do. Even if we're working on a fat loss goal, the slower and more methodically we can do that, so that we're not pushing ourselves below that line where it starts to be dangerous and like we're just hungry all the time. I think of the person who may have overeaten at dinner, and maybe it wasn't even, then we identify with these thoughts like, crap, I didn't follow my plan, or I went over my carbs by 25 grams, whatever it is. It becomes very numbers and data based. And we judge ourselves according to not meeting these certain guidelines or rules. So since I did that, tomorrow, this is what I'm not going to do. And we may be eating adequately, but it's that psychological restriction of, so because of this, I'm not going to do that tomorrow, where we shove something away, we take something away, we restrict and we deny. And it's just that psychological sort of restriction that will be, okay, so since I'm not going to do that tomorrow, then now I can just eat a whole bunch right now. And it just becomes this horrible cycle. So getting rid of, or getting to a place where the binge thoughts are gone, or they're not as frequent. And this is how it typically happens, is that, they're still there, but they're not as strong. And then they come up less frequently. They're here and there. And oftentimes they'll come up in times of stress. Okay. Because we constrict and we tighten. And in times of stress, what we typically start to do is control things. Right? So in that sort of threatened space, it can become more and more uncomfortable, and binge thoughts may appear more in those sorts of situations. But so we have to learn to not only relate to the thoughts differently when they do arise, but we have to begin a process of relating to ourselves differently as well. And this is not something that happens overnight. This is really a process of discovery and asking a lot of questions and getting to know ourselves and understanding our tendencies. Do we not always come back to this, Joe? Like this process of self-awareness, like, what is going on for me right now? What is this feeling that's coming up? And not just staying in our heads, but taking the stairs. I recorded a video just recently about how we have to take the stairs down to the basement below the neck to really kind of get a sense, literally it's sensory, a sense of what's occurring in our bodies, so we can get in touch with the feeling and emotion that's there. But so as individuals who don't binge eat, we become individuals who care for ourselves in ways that honor every part of us. That's every feeling that comes up, every emotion. Once we're eating adequately, again, that's the foundation. Who no longer use compensatory measures when they do binge. So they're not purging. They're not saying, okay, I'm not eating any carbs tomorrow because I had this binge. We're not over exercising and doing 3 hours of cardio because we binged. So that purge, that restriction has to end if we expect for the binge thoughts to disappear, right? And we speak to ourselves from a place of care and compassion. So these are the practices that we have to begin engaging in if we really want to, from a generative place, take care of ourselves and have those thoughts not really be there anymore.
One of the things that I hear you saying, and I phrase it to myself this way, is to be principled or value-based more than anything. And if I held up those two categories of the psychological and the physiological, if you are in a place of physiological deprivation, you will never get rid of binge thoughts. You will never get rid of binge eating, because that's just survival. You will never lose this. You will never get out of it.
You can't remove that biological driver from your life.
Right.
Yeah.
But once you have done that, and it may take a realignment of your goals. If you're just driving toward a certain competition or goal or weight or day on the calendar that's just not going to work, you got to let go of that. But then on the psychological side, Kori, I found in this value-based thinking to say I'm just not a binger. Because I'm not an overeater. On a recent trip, I had to take 3/4 of my breakfast back to our condo. Another meal, I had to leave half of it there. And I'm like, I'm angry. Like, I don't want to leave food.
I know.
That's a value of mine. But a higher value is I'm never going to gain weight I don't want to gain. And I'm not going to overeat. But I could not say that if I was literally starving, if I was in a place of physiological deprivation. You got to have the physiological grounding to allow yourself that space. You have to gradually just say, that's not part of my identity, because the alternative is the opposite, to say, yeah, I binge all the time. I'm a binger.
And you hear that all the time.
Right.
You do. And
Absolutely.
When someone says to me, I'm a binge eater or I'm an emotional eater, I'm like, wow, okay, how do we separate from that? Because that's like who you are. That is, you've literally made it part of your identity, and I want to help them externalize it. So when you say that, like, let's give binge eating a name. That's maybe the first step.
Like Frank?
Like Frank, yes. Frank came to visit today, wasn't super happy that he barged into my house. I didn't even say, like, welcome. Like, there he was. Absolutely. I do this with we have to externalize it so they can get the sense that it's not inside of them. This can be a separate entity. We can learn to relate to it differently. It's a different identity. And we have to learn not to argue with it. So sometimes if we just think of it as a binge thought, like, it's up here, it's inside, I can't get away from it. Let's get it out. And then, like, let's have a conversation with it. What's it saying? What do you want to say back? What's it need to know? What does it think you need to know? Let's not argue, but let's have a dialogue. And it really helps to do that with another person and get it out instead of having the volley go in here, because it just can feel like we're going nuts and crazy. So we also, when Frank comes a knocking, we don't have to answer the door. We don't have to let him in. So it's practicing things like that, different sorts of responses for when Frank shows up. Yeah.
Awesome. All right, cool, Kori. I appreciate that. I think that's incredibly helpful and practical, which is very necessary in a
Mhm.
situation like this. A
Mhm.
lot of people struggling with these things. It's that fixation. It's just so intense that sometimes we can't see all of the things we need to do. We just need
Yeah.
one life preserver. Just somebody throw us one rope we can hold on to.
Mhm.
All right, guys. Thanks for watching and listening. As always, we'll see you next time in the Life Mastery Podcast.